My name is Aesha Rasheed. I am the founder and former executive director of New Orleans Parent Organizing Network. I'm also the producer of a guide to public schools for families called the New Orleans Parents Guide to Public Schools.
I'd love to take you back, ask you to take me back to pre-Katrina. Actually, when you were a reporter, you were covering this stuff for the Times-Picayune. Tell me something about. I've been in the schools before Katrina; they were awful. But you lived it. So tell me about the schools pre-Katrina.
Yeah.
Tell me stories.
Yeah. Well, when I first started covering education, I didn't know what I was doing. And so I thought, I'll go visit schools. That's the only thing I knew to do. And I had spent a fair amount of time in schools in St. Tammany, trying to visit every single school and spend some time. And, you saw kind of normal things, kids playing, an office with staff, and, signing in, and just kind of a feeling of education happening in most schools. I mean, not all schools were perfect, but it was kind of what I was expecting. And I came to New Orleans and I tried to do the same thing. I was like, I'm going to go visit all of these these 127 schools. I'm going to get to every campus. And so I started down that path. And often, not always, but often when I went into a school in New Orleans, there was nobody in the office. I remember standing in the office of one school and there was no adult anywhere to be found. And it's, the day and children are around. And I was just kind of like, do I just wander around the campus? Like, is there a principal somewhere? And it just seemed so sad. It was just like no one was actually minding the school. There were some beautiful exceptions to that, Woodson and Principal Laurie, who's still a principal now. And, there were some schools that were not the norm, but they didn't feel like school to me. They didn't feel like places where children were learning. The other place, one of the sadder times before Katrina was going to John McDonough after the shooting. So in 2004 or 3, there was a really terrible shooting at John McDonough High School, and I live right around the corner from John McDonough, and I had to go there, and the parents were all locked outside. The kids were like screaming from the windows. There was just like this incredible amount of tension and desperation. For obvious reasons, because something really terrible had just happened there. But then even when I went back to visit and to kind of follow up, the children told me things about how they didn't feel like adults kept them safe there. It was just not a safe place. And those were kind of heartbreaking things that happened fairly regularly. So
talk to me a little bit about the academics.
So there was a high school student named Bridget Green, and I met her at an Orleans Parish School Board meeting. It was, I think, actually a forum about maybe the budget or something. And we were at Edna Carr High School for this particular meeting. And this student stood up and said, I want to talk about the fact that I didn't graduate. I am the valedictorian of Fortier High School, and I can't get my diploma. They told me I can't graduate because of the graduate exit exam. And, everyone's kind of like, oh, that's terrible. And we should, so I went and talked to her family, and asked her if I could write about her story. And I did. And basically she had, at that point, failed the graduation exit exam, I want to say 4 times. Because you take it as a sophomore, right? So the first time as a sophomore, and then you take it in the summer. And then if you didn't pass it, then you'll take it again as a junior, and then again in the summer. And then she took it again. So actually I think she had the 5th time. Meanwhile, she was the valedictorian of the high school, meaning she had the highest GPA in the high school, So, she opened up all of her information to me. She let me see her school records. I told her, in order to write about this, I really need to look at the whole picture. And, she was an A-B student, which, first of all, for me, the valedictorian of my school was an all A student. So, that like an A-B student is the top student at the school. She was very smart, lovely, really nice young woman who wanted something exciting in her life. I think she wanted to go on to be a nurse or a doctor, and that had been her dream. And but she came, as she moved towards the senior year and like got excited about being the valedictorian and doing the speech, they said, "Oh, well, you didn't pass, so you're not going to graduate." And I mean, her family was really heartbroken about that. And her aunt, said to me, "How are we to know?" Right? She was getting A's and B's. Like, how would I have known that she was not going to pass? And why would they tell, and I think she really felt like it was stolen from her, that, they'd said, "You're the valedictorian," and then took it back, and she couldn't give the speech, she couldn't walk, and all of these things. And she was just really sad. And so I went to talk to the school and asked for her records and look at, I'm thinking, maybe there's something that they can say about why this would happen. Like, why would this happen at your school? And one of the really frustrating moments for me was when the principal basically said, "Well, not all students, we do the best we can, but they have to do their part." And I'm thinking, what this student has to achieve in order to pass this graduation exam. Whether we like the graduation exam or not, whether we think it is a good measure of whether or not a student's ready for college, this is going to be the barrier to her having the life that she dreams of. And here's somebody who's coming to school and trying, obviously, that you couldn't help her. I'm just thinking, this is your top student. Like, you can help her. And then literally this principal is sitting there with the diploma sitting behind him. I'm interviewing him. I can't even, I'm sitting in his office expecting him to give me some more satisfying answer to why this could happen. And, his answer was basically, sometimes it happens.
So what do you infer? That they were lying to the kid? I mean, is this emblematic of low standards generally in New Orleans
I think that there were a lot of people who didn't believe that children who went to public schools in New Orleans were capable. I think that there are a lot of people who believe that Black children aren't capable. There's a lot of people who believe that poor children aren't capable, which is a symptom of our overall societal racism and classism, And so I think those little expectations that were not just about the kids that were being taught, but were also to some degree internalized, right? Like, when you're constantly labeled as failing and you are supposed to be failing, I think the adults start to carry that feeling of failure too. I don't think it was just about, we don't think these kids can learn. I think that people were really defeated in some ways. I think educators might have felt defeated, that they were like, well, we just keep on being labeled failing and we just keep on, not making it. And so why kind of bother? I don't think they were bad people. I think that there were many good teachers and many people who weren't necessarily doing a good job of teaching, but were good people working inside of the system who just, it was kind of this poisonous environment. I felt there was a very toxic environment in education in New Orleans before Katrina.
Well, there were some people who said, well, Katrina was, well, not quite a blessing, but an opportunity. Was your reaction that this is, the system was destroyed, it was poisoned, what the heck?
I do think the forced closure of all schools because of Katrina presented an opportunity. I don't know that, I think when people say that, the next part of the sentence is sort of an implied, and we took advantage of it and look at what we've done. I actually don't know that we took great advantage of it. I think that we reorganized things, but I think we could have done so much better than what, I think I think there are things that are improved, but the way we did it, right? Like the stop, when I was a reporter, I remember thinking, like, I don't know how you to resolve this depth of corruption, this depth of disenfranchisement, this deep, these deep feelings of inadequacy. Like, how do you resolve that in a system that has to keep going, right? Like, you have to, like, well, every day there are going to be kids here, so you just got to keep on moving forward. How do you stop and say, we're going to just pause for a minute, reflect, rearrange things, do what we need to do, like, get ourselves together and then restart, right? And so I used to think that, like, if only there could just be, like, a few months where there was just no school, right? And then Katrina happens, right? And you're kind of like, well, there you go. Everything is closed, right? We just closed completely down. There are no children there. But I think that, first of all, never would I have thought and never would I want that to happen through the kind of drama and tragedy that was Katrina. One. And then I think when there was the really disrespectful way of firing all the teachers, I feel like that deepened this wound, right? It didn't say, okay, we have a chance to reflect and think about how we want to restart schools. It said, oh, good, we'll get rid of all of you bad seeds and start with a whole different bunch of people because it's all your fault. And I think we're not healed from that. And I think that was a terrible mistake to do it the way it was done. There may have been a lot of teachers that should not have been teaching anymore, but it wasn't all teachers. And to robo-dial people and tell them they're fired is just so disrespectful that we haven't recovered from that kind of wound, you know?
Haven't recovered?
I don't think so. I think a lot of the resistance a lot of the frustration that you hear in community groups about feeling like schools were taken from them is partly because of the way. It's not necessarily the fact of, oh, now we have charter schools, or, oh, now we have different configurations of schools. Because I think that people are willing to get engaged in an environment where schools are very autonomously run, where there's school-based decision-making. I think that folks, when you get into conversations with people, they start to get around to, yeah, no, it makes sense that we should make decisions close to the school. Or no, yeah, we really feel like having schools more deeply engage their communities is a good thing. It's that it was done in such a traumatic way, right? I think it wasn't done in a way that was saying, together we're gonna make something different happen with our schools.
Now, we're talking in mid 2011, but in late 2009, a public poll, 74% support independently run charter schools. Public support was very high, less than 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Are you saying things have changed, or?
I think that people do support some parts of what has happened, but I think that does not discredit the fact that people also feel really wounded, right? Like, I think there are people who are like, yes, I think schools are better, and what was done was wrong. Like, I think you can hold those two contradictions, and I think sometimes people don't understand that those both can be true, right? So I know parents and folks in community who are happy to see children being successful in schools and don't want to take that away. But also, when you talk to them about, like, okay, so what do you think about this overall landscape and the recovery school district, or how that came to be, and they're like, oh, it was terrible. Like, it's like, it's not, this is not this, those are not the same questions, right? So do you think that schools are better? Maybe you do, right? But that doesn't mean that you think that the way that we went about getting to the system that we have was the right thing to do. And I think that's the distinction, and that's why there are these still ongoing wounds. Also, the way that it gets talked about. There were a lot of people who worked in public education before Katrina who work in public education now. And it's disconcerting to me that the way it gets framed sometimes is as if we took the schools and we got rid of all those bad people and we have all these new people and that's why everything works. When in fact there's a mix, right? There's new people and veteran people in there. And I think when we talk to folks who however they choose to self-label, if people call themselves like part of the education reform movement or however, I think when you really talk to people, we say that, right? Like in rooms to each other, we say, oh no, there are veterans, and like we really respect some of those veteran principles. We really think that we needed them back, and there are some new people that are really exciting, and it's a mix. But somehow that doesn't get translated in the like soundbite frames out there, And so it's like, oh, what we did is we brought all these new people in, and that's how we fixed the school system. Which A, it isn't fixed, but B, that's not true. It's a mix. It's a mix of new and veteran folks that are in here doing the day-to-day work of making sure that schools do what they need to do for kids.
It sounds like you're saying that there's not a high level of public understanding. When that poll came out in 2009 and 74% said we support independently run charter schools, you were quoted as saying, well, in a way that's kind of a knee-jerk reaction. People don't understand. It sounds good in charter schools.
Right.
Talk to me a little bit about sort of what the public understanding is.
So I continue to find that most people don't really understand what charter schools are, right? A lot of my work is talking to people about what charter schools are. And I continuously find that people don't totally get that it in itself is not a fix of a school, right? Like saying now it's a charter is not what fixes it, right? So a bad school that then becomes an independently run charter school could be better if some other things, has a strong leader, has good teachers, pulls together a good, strong curriculum, invests its parents and community, could be good. A bad school that becomes a charter school that doesn't do any of that is not going to be better, right? And so I think that charter in this community has become shorthand for better school or improved school, right? For one thing. The other thing is that because so many selective admission or pseudo-selective admission OPSB schools have become charter schools because they had sort of the both community-based strength and political will, and also they were doing it, right? Like they were showing their scores were strong, right? So your Lushers, your Audubons, your Hines, right? Have become charter schools. People in some ways have almost just applied, those were better schools. Oh, they're charters now, so they're better schools. Like that is what you equate to charter, right? So like, oh, a charter is a school like Lusher, which is not, those aren't the same thing, right? Like Lusher happens to be a charter, and it's all the other things that Lusher is. Audubon happens to be a charter, and it's all the other things that Audubon is. There are other schools that are charters that aren't like Lusher or Audubon, and it's just a form of governance, and I don't think that people really get that. I think because that's inside baseball to some degree. For a lot of people in the community, they care about how is the school interacting with me? Do I generally do my friends and family and, folks who are directly impacted by the school feel happy with it? And so that's part of it.
So, go ahead.
Go ahead. I mean, second, I think there has been an active media messaging and framing around that's very pro-independent, autonomous charter schools. And I'm saying that kind of carefully because I don't mean to say that it's like brainwashing or a bad thing, right? Like people who believe in it have put their case out there, right? And I think that there's been less of a conversation about, well, what could we do with directly operated schools? How could, what's good about them, right? Because there are some directly operated schools that are doing well. So, I mean, does that mean that, I think there's no conversation on one side and there's just this sort of constant charters are great, and a constant stream of independent charter schools marketing themselves, right? And saying we are awesome, which leads to this sort of general community sense of I read that they are awesome. I read it in a pamphlet that they gave me, but so that's information that I have, right? I think there are some people who are looking at actual outcomes and data who are seeing that where you have seen improvements, it has largely been at schools that are charter schools that are specifically about closing the achievement gap, right? And that makes sense, right? And I think those people are talking about, we see improvement amongst charter schools faster, but not all, but some, faster than we're seeing in directly operated schools and charter schools that aren't about closing the achievement gap. So, I mean, those folks, I think when they say we like autonomous charter schools, it's more based on outcomes. But I think the general public is kind of like, oh, I've heard that schools are better. Yay. I mean, I don't know that they're necessarily, I don't know that people are necessarily have sat down and had a lot of deep conversations about what they think, what are the good and bad about the current system that we have, and have come to a decision like, oh, this is on the whole better than the system that we had before.
I can imagine a conversation, somebody saying to you, I like charter schools, and you say, what kind do you like? And they say, what do you mean, what kind? A charter school. And then right. You say, well, there's this kind of charter, and there's that kind of charter. I mean, my sense is the public doesn't really understand.
I don't think that people who aren't involved in general totally understand what is happening. I mean, I think they're sort of seeing things seem to be getting better. And so let's stay on the path of things getting better, right? I also think that we have tended to frame the conversation as if there's a necessary binary, right? We can either stay over here where things are getting better, or we can say it's not getting better and that means we go back to what it was. And I don't think that that's actually, that's not the binary that I want to live in, right? I want to live in a world that says we've seen some improvement. Let's be honest about where the challenges are, and let's work on those challenges and figure out what do we need to continue that. And I do feel like that conversation is happening inside.
Well, let's have that conversation. Tell me about the challenges. We're not going to go back
Right.
to the old way. We're not going
Right.
to say this is perfect.
Right.
Tell me about the challenges.
So I think some of the challenges that we have now are not so different than the challenges we had before Katrina because they are persistent educational challenges. Special education and how children with different learning needs are being served holistically and completely. Parent engagement, how parents are understanding their role in schools and how they are activating that, you know. And I think there's a general, I think both of those things are interestingly tied to our assumptions about what people are capable of, and race and class kind of over sort of deeply embedded assumptions about race and class, right? We as a country tend to think that poor people are poor because they are wrong. They're lazy, they didn't work hard enough, something, right? Like it's not, we don't tend to think like we have a structural system that really kind of requires a certain percentage of people to be poor in order for us to have all of the like amenities that we have when we're middle class or upper middle class. And so when folks who have that kind of layering that's deep inside, that's unassessed, the way that we go about handling folks who are poor is often very paternalistic, right? Like it's sort of like, I know that you're not doing better because, quite frankly, you're incapable of it. So I'm just going to do for you, you know. And I'm trying to be nice, like, you know, I don't want to make you think too hard because, and I think that is a lot of how parents in this school system or system of schools are basically treated. There's not a lot of, we really believe in your power to engage and give us feedback about what works well. There's sort of this sense of, don't you worry your little head about it, just, you know, sign up for a school, send your kid to this school, and, you know, we don't really want to engage you in conversations about what the school should be or what kind of things that you really need. Now, I think that there are educators who want to do that, but I think that want that's in our intellect doesn't seep down into addressing that fundamental, like, but I don't really believe it's possible. For the same reason that some schools in New Orleans before Katrina weren't having high expectations of their kids because at some level they didn't believe it was possible. I think we do that with parents now in the city, like especially schools that are serving high poverty communities, right? And then that gets reinforced when parents do come in with lots of challenges and like situations that are real, you know, and they're moving multiple times and doing things that, you know, as a, you know, middle class person, I'm like, why are you doing this? Like, why wouldn't you just stabilize your life and get your kid to school on time every day? You know, I mean, like, it just sort of gets reinforced when we have those experiences. So I think that's a big challenge. I heard a man from the State Department of Education posit that the reason why we have such a high percentage of children going to school outside of their neighborhood is because parents are voting with their feet and choosing to bypass the school close to their home and go across town because they wanted a better school. And that's certainly true sometimes. I know some parents like that who, you know, I know a parent who lives on the West Bank who didn't like her child's school on the West Bank and said, found a better school and now sends her kids to school, you know, over here. It definitely is happening, but I don't think that we can assume that that's happening, that that's why 86% of families are doing that, right? I think we have to ask the question, you know, and be diligent about wanting the reflective answer of, so why are you sending your kid across town? Because I also talked to a lot of parents who are sending their kids across town because they couldn't get into the school closer to them or because they didn't know the process of it. It might not have even been that like the school was full at the point of enrollment, but they didn't know how to do it. And by the time they got themselves together to send their kid to school, the only one that they were told about was across town. You know, and so I think that we can't just assume that 86% means that this is all working well.
The system, the new system,
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering about whether it is respectful of parents. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I don't think as a whole the system that we have, the system of schools that we have is respectful of parents. And the evidence of that to me is parent engagement and information doesn't get prioritized. Budgetarily, it doesn't get prioritized, like in terms of like what to do first in making decisions about schools, it doesn't get prioritized, right? So there's a whole lot of information that, you know, there's all these mandates about information that's supposed to go to parents, right? But I don't see actually the systems providing that information. I'm sympathetic to the fact that in the aftermath of Katrina and the sort of scramble to figure out, and where people were literally, and somebody recently said like hair on fire, right? Like it was like we have to open a school building somewhere, put children in it, and teachers, like in order for people to come back home, right? This is very much tied to, can people come home to their city? So I understand that in the beginning, and that's why I and other folks stepped up and said, here's the part that we can do, right? So I said, here's the part I could do. I can make a guide to schools because that would help parents and hopefully teachers and other people who want to engage with schools and neighborhoods and all of this, and they'll help people understand. But we're 5 years out, and still the systems have not said this is something that is important, and so we should maybe make sure it's enabled to happen, even if it's enabled to happen through an external organization like New Orleans Parent Organizing Network, right? I mean, it's not that I think that they have to do everything, but I don't feel like at a leadership level, the system has taken it up, right? And that's not to say that there haven't been individuals inside of the districts who have been supportive of the Parents Guide, right? But, people think that it's produced by the districts, and it's not, So to me, that's an indication of how much we value and prioritize parents' voice. It's very low. So that's another thing that I think is a place of not prioritizing, right? The process of enrolling kids in schools is a coalition of folks, including myself, have over multiple years shaped this thing called the Common Application process. Before that, it was totally Wild West. It was each school, different form, different timeline. Each school had a different situation, right? In the process of producing the Parents Guide, I saw how complicated that was and thought there's just no way that you could constantly be in the place of having missed the deadline, like everywhere. Like you could be a parent who came to town and said, okay, this school, great. Oh, the deadline was yesterday, crap. And then go to the next school and be like, oh crap, the deadline was last week. You could just constantly be in this place throughout your process of looking for a school. So if we're really asking parents to choose based on their real information about how good is the school and is it a good fit for my child, then we have to give them some sense of and this is what the process is going to look like, and this is how it's going to look fair. I mean, added to that is the reality that in the past, New Orleans has had a school choice system that conventional wisdom and sort of the word on the street was that it wasn't very fair. There have been many fights about, that it was very political, that it was about who you knew, and that, and I don't know if those things were true or not, but that's how people felt. And so when people believe something, then that's just, at some point it's true or not, this is the belief that people have. So given that baggage that folks already had, then bringing this new idea of school choice, there was a lot of distrust. Why would I turn my application into you and wait for you to get back to me? If how do I know? What if you throw it away? And I talked to parents who said I brought my application to that school, but I think they just threw it in the trash because they looked at me. Or, I said my child was a special needs child, and I'm sure that's why I didn't get in. And that may not have been happening. And in fact, I think at most schools that probably wasn't happening. But the fact that parents believed it was happening means it's a problem that we have to address, right? And so, so we came together to try to come up with this uniform process, right? And we worked really hard to get input from schools. NOLA Pond brought input from parents, and to really kind of build something that we could all use together. So the way it works now is the Recovery School District schools, charter and directly operated, use the same form, a one-page form application that you can apply to any school in the system with, and you turn it in by a certain date. And then the schools have until a certain date to do a lottery if they have more students that apply than they have space available for, or to just go down the list of who's applied. And then they notify parents. So parents are to be notified by a certain date. And that was an important piece, right? Because I think there's this tendency, it's like a job, I think schools were thinking of it more like a job application, right? We'll get back to you when we get back to you, right? But it's kind of if I'm a parent, I need to know when you're going to get back to me, because I got to make decisions based on whether or not you have gotten back to me, and so we set that date. And then parents have a certain date by which they have to get back to the school, because on the flip side, the school needs to know, right? And so then a parent can say, if they were offered a spot available, there was a spot available for their child at, say, 5 or 6 schools, they can choose one of those schools, right? Right now, there is nothing to ensure that the parent only chooses one school, right? So because it's all paper and because it's all school dependent, if I'm a parent and I get calls from 7 schools, the first school that calls me I might say, great, I'm so excited, I really want to go to Kit Believe. But then, Success Prep calls me. That probably wouldn't happen because they don't have the same grades. But another school calls and I say, oh, yeah, I want to go there. But I never call the first school. The first school still has my child enrolled, right? And so it's not until August that we figure all that out, which is very chaotic. And so it means that while another thing that I recently heard is that most of the schools don't have waiting lists. And so that's evidence that, there's a lot of choices. But we don't know, how would a parent know what schools do or don't have waiting lists? Like the only way to find that out is to call every school, right? So at this point in the school year, which we're in May now, and the applications were due on April 8th. The process of the schools doing their lotteries and all that happened by late April, right? And then parents were notified, and they're to notify schools. So if you're a parent who is looking for a school right now, your only recourse is to call every single school. Like there's not any place to go and say, where's a school that is likely to have a space, or where are the 10 schools that definitely have a space in second grade? Or, you would just have to call down the line.
With today's technology, it's kind of bizarre.
Right. And to me, the fact that there's a lot of smart people, brilliant people working on the problem of education in this city. The fact that we haven't pulled ourselves together to turn some brilliance to the question of how do we help parents navigate all of this, to me is an indication of how much we don't respect parents. It's not a priority. It's just not a priority. And the priority is schools filling up. The priority is, what schools need, which is important. I think we need to make sure that we prioritize what schools need, but I think we also have to, if we really are saying we're going to have a school system of choice that relies on parents to make informed decisions about their children's education, we have to A, inform them, and we have to B, create mechanisms that allow for that information to be meaningful.
One of the things we hear, Aesha, is that schools in the filling up process, they're, even if they are not supposed to be selective, they may be selective. They may be saying, ooh, that kid's special needs. I mean, do parents, talk with me about the playing field, I guess, the notion of a level playing field in terms of that.
I'm not sure that schools select. I mean, except the ones that openly select. Like there are some that have testing and all of that. I'm not sure that that's happening, but I do think that the perception of it is the problem, right? I mean, if I'm a parent of a child with special need and I really feel, either because I've had a specific experience or because I've heard from my, fellow parents, that schools are going to not want to take my child because my child has this special need, then I'm not going to apply, right? And so it almost becomes this chicken and egg situation where I don't turn in applications to schools because I'm really sure that they're not going to take my child, right? And then, and I think we have to understand that these processes are not about buying a car. It's not about inanimate objects. It's about somebody's kid, right? Like the emotional process that goes through when a parent has to release their child, this, no matter how great we think their parenting skills are or struggling they are, it's still their child that they love, and they have to release them to another group of strangers who are going to have them for most of the day. There's a lot of emotion in that. And I think that we there's this idea that it's just like a market process, right? Like, oh, it's like shopping for a car. We'll make something like, Carfax or, I'm like, it's just, kids are not cars. And so we have to not only have really clear systems, but we also have to understand that we need to be attentive to the perception of things and how folks feel while they're going through the process as much as we do to the actual nuts and bolts of it.
From the things you said, it's there's a legacy of distrust that the schools were terrible and parents knew it and didn't trust them, or so on and so forth. That notion of a legacy of mistrust. Talk a little bit about overcoming that, I guess.
Yeah. I think this is one of the things that when I have conversations with my friends who are leading schools or educators, I know it's hard, right? Because it's like you haven't done anything. At least that's how they feel. Like, what did I do? Like, why should anyone mistrust me? I'm perfectly trustful. And I feel the same way. If somebody questions me and is like, oh, I don't know if I trust you, I'm kind of like, what did I do to you? But what I think is important to know is that folks are bringing baggage from one, pre-Katrina experiences with a system that was not serving all kids. And also from many experiences that happen now where they've been disrespected, and also experiences that happen in their lives that maybe aren't school, like, other government entities that impact the lives, especially of people in low income families, right? There's like a constantly sort of invasion by various governmental forces, and often it happens in a really disrespectful and frustrating way. And so I might be bringing all that frustration to you as a school leader, and maybe you didn't do anything to me today, but I'm bringing it all, right? Like all of it, like you're getting it all of it. And I think, that's why it takes this like consistent patient and consistent sort of I think school leaders and school staffs have to be able to say, like, this person is not this is not necessarily about me personally. This is about, right, frustrations that folks are having, and we need to figure out a way to channel that frustration into doing something positive that is pro getting to a place with their child, right? And I think that doesn't happen a lot. I also think that, like, it takes, like, consistent follow through. I mean, in a way, and I'm saying this, I don't at all think that parents are equatable to children, but relationships with people, right? Like when you relate to a child, you have to build trust over time. You don't just say, trust me, right? Like you actually have to be consistent. And so same thing with any human, right? Like you don't just say, oh, you got to trust me. You actually have to like do what you say, be where you're supposed to be, and build trust over time. And I think that's what it's going to take. And the other thing the reason why I think the question of race is really important is that similarly, I don't think that white folks often hear black folks talk about the fact that a lot of black folks don't trust white folks. Like, just period, right? Like, and for good reason. Like, not, like not that like all white folks are bad, but because there's a lot of experience that black people have had at the hands of mostly white folks that have been the groundings of this mistrust. And so it's not crazy. And it also maybe isn't, it is a barrier to us moving forward as a community, right? So, but if we don't really address that, right? So I think like you have folks who are running schools who are, young, white, and not from here, right? So that's like 3 reasons that parents are going to be like, and I'm looking at you, and I'm looking at you askance, and I'm not totally trusting you. So you've got to figure out how to overcome those barriers and know that like, look, I'm young and I'm not from here, and I'm white, and so you might not trust me. So here's how I'm going to be really consistent repeatedly so that you get to a place of being able to trust me. And know that like that's a process. It's not just like I show up one day and it's a blank slate. It's not a blank slate. There's people are judging already from their own past experiences, because we all do, because that's what humans do. We have past experiences and they help us inform how we're going to make decisions in the future. Everyone does that, and so do parents, and so do kids, and so do community members, and we have to like really actually confront those things and have those conversations up front a little bit more than I think we have.
Yeah, but if I'm a young and white and I come in and I would say, hey, look, I'm a well-meaning person. Of course you can trust me. I mean, it seems like it would be asking a lot of that young white out-of-towner, and there are a lot of them in schools, to understand that context.
And I think that's a system question, right? So if we're going to bring, as a system of schools, a lot of folks from other places, or bring up lots of young folks, or bring, have communities of a lot of white teachers and educators who are bringing real skills and talent and passion. So yes, we need all that. But if that's how the system is going to fill those positions, the system also needs to think about like, how are we going to address the reality of race in this context, right? Like, it's not, and I personally, and I don't feel like when I get into real deep conversations with folks who are resistant to the influx of young white teachers from elsewhere, who might stand up in meetings and sort of, fume about it, when we get into deeper conversations, most people are like, well, it's not that I'm saying don't come. I'm just saying when you come, like, you know what I mean? Come correct. As like come with some humility, come, and people are asking for folks to be reflective. Now, I don't think that the young white teacher coming from somewhere else has the skills to be reflective on their own, because that's part of being young, right? I mean, part of being young is not to be super reflective yet, because you don't have a lot to be reflective about yet. So what we should be doing is figuring out how to help them be reflective, right? How do we help support those teachers in those ways? We're so excited that you're bringing all this energy and passion, and that's awesome. So how are we as school communities going to, create circles of reflection for teachers? How are we going to support you? Because they're going to get, the other thing is that that's about supporting them too, because they're going to get buffered with these reactions of distrust, right? And that does something to a person, right? If you're walking around all the time and the parents that you're working with don't trust you all the time, like, it starts to make you feel like question yourself or feel like they're crazy, or it affects the relationship. So how are we giving them those kinds of skills, right? Are we talking about race and institutionalized racism? Are we talking, is that a conversation in our teacher community, of folks who are coming from elsewhere? Are we giving them a real chance to understand New Orleans communities and saying, like, these are some of the things that New Orleans has experienced in the past that is why New Orleans is resistant to outsiders?
You've asked a lot of questions. Talk about,
What the solutions are.
Really, I guess the question is, has New Orleans, have Paul Vallis and Paul Bassett, have they done that? Because they've certainly relied on a lot of young white out-of-towners. Has the system done the kinds of things that...
I haven't seen the system providing that kind of support for teachers or teaching staffs. I think there are schools who have tried, in these sort of various ways. And, I understand the challenge of being a district in a system of schools that's fairly autonomous. Like, could Paul Vallis have said, I demand that all teachers get this kind of training on cultural competency? He could have, but I don't know that would have gone over so well. But what could have happened is, just like when we built the common application process, we got buy-in from schools, we provided some support, we said, like, we want feedback from you about how this could be done really well, right? So similarly, can we say, as a community, we want to have these conversations about cultural competency, right? Could the RSC be convening that kind of conversation? Could the OPSB be convening that kind of conversation, right? They're not powerless in all of this. And so instead, I feel like we've just kind of been like, we'll just ignore that, right? We'll just sort of marginalize people who are raising these concerns, and the ones that are loudest will eventually sound crazy and go away, which is true, and then the rest of us will just have to kind of swallow that and keep on moving,
we followed a bunch of Teach for America teachers. I was thinking of one young man, idealistic young man from Yale, who I think genuinely felt that he had an opportunity to maybe not save the world, but certainly he was coming in
ready to save people.
Yeah. I wonder if that attitude is common.
Yeah. To some degree we all do. I think we all are looking for a way to make a positive impact on the world around us, right? Like, I have that struggle, right? Like, I'm kind of like, it's on me to make sure all parents have information about schools. It's not, right? And I'm not going to be able to do it by myself, right? It's not going to be, me or even the whole staff of NOLA Pond, all five of us. Like, we're not going to do it ourselves. But
when you're coming from outside, here I am, things will be better now.
Right. It has this extra connotation. And when you're coming from a different community, I think, there's when you're racially a different community, and also when you're culturally, like, this isn't your community, it does have this whole other level of connotation. So yeah, I think that's a big piece of what folks feel frustrated about, right? That, like, you're coming to save me, but not listening to what I need, and not asking me any questions about, like, how would I like to be rescued, or what, what is it that I'm really missing in my life, or what do I really need? Which, that's part, after Katrina, one of the things that we often, I think many of us talked about, were these ways that, like, folks would try to, or governmental structures or nonprofit structures would try to help, right? Like the Red Cross. There used to be these like food trucks. The Red Cross, in their attempt to provide food to people who were here, did this food truck thing where they would put food and they'd drive around neighborhoods and say like hot food, hot food. And, you know, it was like hospitality says that you don't criticize that somebody's giving you something, right? Like you're never like a critic of it. You just say like, thank you. But the thing is, by and large, we were like, I don't need actually your not that good, actually hot food. Like what I could really use is, you know, some bleach, right? Like, I mean, there's things that I need. Or, you know, I remember that we went to Red Cross station to get supplies, right? And the thing that we couldn't find was water, right? We were like, we just need water. But we went day after day and there was never water, but there was lots of other stuff that we didn't need, right? Like and speaking of bleach, got this like ridiculously huge thing of bleach that I was like, okay, this is enough bleach forever, but I'm going to take it. But what we really wanted was water. We got back to our houses and we're like, well, we still don't have water and we still don't have drinkable water, but we've got plenty of bleach and, you know, some toothpaste. Like, I mean, there's like things that, you know, and so you don't want to be disrespectful to people who are here to help, right? Like, it's like, I'm glad that you're here to help. You went out of your way to help. You made changes in your life to help. That's great. And so, but to the people who are coming to help, like, understand that you might not be coming with the right stuff. Like, you might need to listen. You really need to listen to the people that you're trying to help and see, like, what it is that they actually need and see if what you have is what they need. Like, it has to be a matchup, you know? So I think Teach for America and Teach NOLA have grown tremendously in New Orleans. And I don't have a lot of experience with Teach for America in other places, but just, you know, my observation of what's happening in New Orleans. And I think charter schools, like the ideas of charter schools, this sort of notion of autonomous and the charter movement has also been changed by New Orleans, right? Because TFA has this huge core here now, right? And this huge alumni core here. So they're, I think, able to have the kind of conversations about teacher quality and about connection to localness and retention that they may not be able to have in other places, which is kind of amazing, right? So they can actually be transformed, you know, how they do things and what they. I sat next to the executive director on a panel recently who she was basically saying, like, it's pushing us to think differently about how we engage our alumni here because we have a way bigger alumni core than we had before, you know. And I think similarly Teach NOLA, you know, and I've been a selector for Teach NOLA, like I've selected teachers, and I feel like I have observed Teach NOLA thinking about why folks want to come here and prioritizing the need for people who have some connection to this place, you know, whether it's because I'm from here or if it's, you know, I actually specifically want to be in New Orleans. Like, I'm not just like wanting to go send me wherever, you know, like I'm just ready to save some children, especially brown children, right? Like, I mean, but, you know, that are kind of like, I specifically want to teach in New Orleans because I think, you know, in general, New Orleans is not a place that is very healthy if you are not meant to be here, right? Like, if you really are not about being in New Orleans, like, it eventually causes you a lot of distress and you have to leave. Like, I've seen that happen to people where they're like, I just came to wherever, and New Orleans was just a place I was going, and, you know, I didn't matter what city I was going to or where I was going to be. But then you get here and there's so much that we don't do well in New Orleans. There's so much frustration that, like, eventually you just can't stay here if you're not committed to being here. If you don't also feel, like, enchanted and, like, invested in the beauty and the great things about the city, right?
That notion, you know, I'm coming down here to save the brown people. I mean, it sounds like that you've seen that attitude, or
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that attitude and across a lot of different kinds of, you know, like in volunteer groups, in, you know, in educator groups. I mean, I don't think that that's the majority. I think there's a lot of people who are more reflect more than that. But I've definitely seen that attitude. I've definitely seen an attitude from people who feel like their mission in life is to save Black and brown children, right? Who are not themselves Black and brown. And so don't get me wrong, I think the belief that it's important that we do a better job of providing education to Black children and brown children is something that I want lots of folks to believe, right? Like I want lots of folks to be thinking about and saying like, we haven't done a good job and we need to do this. But you can't come with the attitude that you specifically are the savior of Black and brown children, right? Which is different than saying we as a society need to do a much better job of supporting like folks of color, and we as a society have like benefited from folks of color being disenfranchised, right? Like that's a very different thing that I think like we can have conversations about. But these Black people don't know how to do for themselves, and so I'm gonna come do for them is not a helpful attitude, right? Because you know what I mean? Like in fact, people of communities of color, some of the very outcomes that we see in communities of color are the direct results of folks surviving, right? It's like, it's what people have learned to do to survive in a society that was not about helping them find their power. So you can't just come in and say, well, you don't know how to do for yourself, so I'm going to take it. Like people actually have been doing for themselves. Like poor people are incredibly resilient. It's really hard to be poor. Like it's a lot of work to be poor. Like it's a lot of stress to be poor, you know? I mean, and like, you know, I think there's some people who, if they had to trade places, you know, with somebody who like lived way below the poverty line, they would not make it because they wouldn't have the resiliency, you know? And so I think knowing that, like there's something amazing about having been resilient enough to make it. But now we need to figure out how to get past the defense mechanisms that you had to build up to be able to survive, to get to a place where you can actually take advantage of the fullness of what's available for you in our society.
I mean, one of the things that it was eerie, but I wonder if you would talk a little bit about sort of like a city without children, or
Yeah. I came home in October of 2005, and it was really, for one thing, there weren't a lot of women in the city, right? And so that was an interesting dynamic, right? Where it was just like a heavily male city because there were all of the National Guard folks and the various kind of cleanup crew type folks and, you know, first responders, which, you know, percentage-wise, there were women in amongst those ranks, but percentage-wise it was mostly men. And then the people coming home to do, you know, work on their homes. It was interesting to be in spaces where there was just a majority of men. And then no children. Like, you just didn't hear kind of that soundtrack that I never noticed it, right? Like before, that there's this kind of soundtrack of children like laughing and talking, their little like high-pitched voices doing stuff, and through the course of the day you'll hear some here or there, you know, like, and it's just kind of normal. It's just that wasn't around. You rarely saw children, and it was really special to see some, right? Like to see a child. I have a friend who had sons who were small then, and she was here. And people used to just come up to her and just, you know, like weep and want to pick them up and, you know, and just be like, oh, I haven't seen a child in, you know, however many days or however many weeks. And there's something, it feels like a dying place, right? Like not having children makes, I think it makes, it just doesn't feel like life renewing itself. And so there was this feeling of like sort of death and despair, I think, to be in a place without children. You know, and you go by playground, it was just extra poignant to like drive by flooded playgrounds and there were just no children in them and no children around and never hear the voices and sounds of children.
I never thought of that as a sort of a soundtrack, but I of course remember going by the playgrounds which had been flooded. Tell me more about sort of what it feels like.
Yeah, I mean, there was so much, such a feeling of sort of despair and trauma, and you're just constantly buffered with this, you know, kind of deep sadness and mourning, you know, and then also to not have children around to kind of lift some of that up or lift that away. I think, you know, I definitely felt kind of bereft, right? Like it was one of the things that was very upsetting. And then to think about things, have conversations with folks who had children where they were very real worries about, could children be brought here, right? Like, is it safe? Like, is the water safe for them? Can they be in this environment? There was a time period where pregnant women and small children were kind of cautioned to stay away because of like the level of poison. And I think that is another place that makes you think about frailty, right? Like that you're kind of like, it's too poisonous for children here, right? Like, does that mean we should all not be here, right? There's just this kind of like, is that okay? And then I remember when they, said that they didn't think they were going to reopen schools for, I think this was like 2005. This is late 2005, and the school system basically saying we can't reopen any schools until a year from now, right? And that feeling of like, no, like we can't not be able to bring children here. Like we can't not have schools, because then that means we don't have children. And if we don't have children, then we don't have families and we don't have life, right? I think there's this, children are the representation of life, right? Like us producing ourselves and continuing to grow. And, it's like spring flowers, right? Like children are that, and
they just
we can't. They weren't here, and there was this moment in time where it felt like we wouldn't have them here for a while, and that I reacted to it strongly. It was like, oh my God, like we can't not have schools like for a year. That's terrible. And I think a lot of people did, and I think it was one of the things that churned a lot of that early chartering, right? Where like communities were like, no, we need our school because we want our children. And so we're going to rebuild our school. And I think it's one of the things about neighborhoods and their feelings about how the system is dealing with where schools are placed, is that in a lot of school districts, there's these questions of opening and closing schools and which buildings and all of that kind of stuff that is difficult and complicated, right? In New Orleans, the added complexity of neighborhoods knowing and believing that a school is this important nexus, that it is proof of life in a way, right? And so like you need your school, right? Like you will never be, I think that's the Lower Ninth Ward is like, we must have a school because otherwise our neighborhood is dying, right?
Somebody said to me that these reformers almost took advantage of that desire for schools, and they said, "Oh, we can put these charters in." I mean, that people were so desperate,
right?
Because you say schools and children represent life. Is it?
I mean, I think I think it's a mistake to think of people who label themselves or are labeled as reformers as entirely like outside of, right? I mean, I think many people who are part of the architects of this system of schools that we have now were experiencing the same thing, right? Where people living in the city who saw that there weren't children here and reacting to that, and wanting to see something happen. I think that some of that early chartering was, and this is one of the things, right? Like charter schools aren't the same, right? So there's the type of charter schools that came about because somebody was like, OPSB isn't going to reopen schools, and so we as a school community are going to like write a charter and get our charter up in like Audubon, or there were several schools that were kind of in the process of trying to become charter schools before Katrina, which is something I think that we sort of lose sight of. And then Algiers, the Algiers community basically saying we need schools open, and we're gonna move forward on that. Whatever else is happening, we are viable. We can do this. We have families that are ready to come home right now, so let's get our schools open. Opened up chartering. I don't know that folks who were pro-charter took advantage of that. I think that folks who were very pro-charter took advantage of OPSB being incapable of opening schools to step up the recovery school districts, power and breadth, right?
I mean, Milton Friedman, the economist, wrote a paper saying this is a chance to privatize the system.
Right.
So there was that. Yeah. There was chaos.
Right.
I wonder, are you of a mind that, given the chaos, that they did a pretty good job? I mean, what is your sense of I mean,
Oh God.
There we are.
Yeah. I acknowledge that I think in the beginning, given what was happening, people did definitely, I think, did a good job and the best they could, which wasn't quite good enough. I mean, it wasn't good enough because we had 300 kids on like a waiting list, right? But at the same time, I'm sympathetic to the fact that there weren't adequate buildings. Now, I wish that we lived in a community that said, hey, you know what? We have hotel rooms. We have like hotel space at the downtown that didn't get flooded. Let's like lend that to schools so that they can operate here. I think there's some things that we as a community could have done more cohesively, right? And I think that the responses weren't always like that it was indicative of how fractured our community was around education in the first place, right? Like that because, there was such a sense of like the schools are stuck and they're terrible and I'm just disconnected from them altogether. There wasn't kind of like a community swelling of like, we got to get schools up and running right now and figure this out. But I think given all that, I feel like early on the RSD kind of did the best it could to like ramp up and get some schools open. I think that I think that I think I think people have worked really hard and we've done some amazing things, right? Like there have been some amazing progress made and at some levels there's that we're building all of these schools, and that construction is going to happen is amazing. Like really amazed at like the way that neighborhoods have come together and like generated schools out of, and like kind of pulled themselves together, and all that is a great, there's some shining stories and amazingness. And also we are seeing achievement gap we're pushing on the achievement gap. We are improving outcomes for kids in a lot of schools. What I'm disappointed in is now that there was this whole community of people who saw themselves, I think, as sort of outsiders who finally had an opportunity, who had just been like chomping at the bit with good ideas, who finally like were able to get in there and do some stuff and like be a little bit maverick. And now, and maybe this is just the natural reality of things, now those folks have become the system, right? And so they are resistant sometimes to other ideas coming in, right? So it's like we've sort of like, I've noticed that a changing of place, right? There's like now a different status quo that seems to want to be protected from other changes coming in. Like I noticed that we are creating kind of chains of schools, right? So there's not as much space for hey, I have a really good idea of a kind of school that I think could really work. Like, want to get it open and see it, try something out. The, sort of status quo establishment, which is the folks who once were outside with a good idea, are kind of like, well, we don't know. We're going to go with these people who already run 5 schools, right? Like we want, we want to keep growing these until we have what seems like we're moving towards these sort of mini districts or charter schools. And I don't mind that we have those systems. I mean, I think there's some smartness about economy of scale and all of that. But are we continuing to be open to a new waves of thinking? I feel like that's starting to not be true.
Someone was talking, a couple people actually have talked about this, a tension between excellence as defined by test scores and innovation. You're coming in with this new thing, but you're going to be tested 3 times a year.
Right.
That there's and now you talk about like there's a new establishment. I wonder, would you play with that notion of innovation versus, if they're in harmony or if they're in conflict?
I mean, I think there is a conflict between innovation and the ideas of excellence as predicated by test scores, because and I think there's also there's some fear about feeling like we don't experiment, right? There's been a lot of charges that all of this is experimentation on kids, and so now I think there's this new establishment that's like, well, we don't want it. We want to show that we're doing what's proven, and yeah. So I mean, I think like, are we open up the space to say we want to try something different? We want to support folks who want to try new ideas and different ideas. And one of the distinctions of that is there was a lot of significant amount of funding to support innovation early on, right? Now there's not funding for that. There's funding for replication. like that's where we've put funding. And it's not that I think that we shouldn't replicate what's good, what works, but if we really believe that the beauty of having this system of schools that's a little bit disjointed is the opportunity for different schools to be trying different things and to see what is happening, then we should also be supporting that continued innovation. And we also, and I think another critique that I have about like this system as it exists is that there isn't real support mechanisms for schools to collaborate, right? Like across time. So there's not real, yes, educators are free agents who can go and say, I see the school across town doing something great and I want to talk to them. They are capable of that, right? But I don't think that happens as much as we would like it to. And I think that we don't there's always carrot and stick, right? There's that, the system always has the ability to kind of like say, like, we want to bring together, smart educators from across the city to like give them opportunity to cross, or we want to incentivize that happening some kind of way. I mean, I don't think it's always about convening people, because you can convene people and they could just sit there and look at each other, right? But, you could say, we want to incentivize. So if you have a great idea that you want to share with other schools, we'll incentivize you being able to do that by providing some resources or, offering a sabbatical and there's some things that we don't think about that. So innovation, I think to make innovation, one, I think you support the nurturing of innovation if you really want innovation to be happening. But then I also think that you support the sharing of the innovations between each other, which we have not done. We've kind of set people up to be in competition in a way that does not say, I really want to make sure that all schools know about this great new idea that I have for improving reading, because actually I don't. We're in competition with each other, so we there's this disincentive to like really share.
Maybe the schools have gotten good enough, so now they can just worry about replicating.
Yeah, I don't think that. I don't think that's true. It doesn't. We're not seeing that.
Not saying what.
We're not. I don't think that schools have gotten good enough that we don't need to. That all we have to do is replicate, because we're not seeing consistency and improvement yet. And also, education is a long game. It is not, it is not 1 year's test scores that make a difference, right? Like 1 year's test scores or 2 years or even 5 years test scores are markers to show whether or not we're on the right path, but they don't themselves prove out anything. Like, we won't know. I'm very involved in a school in my community, and, people come to me and say, I'm so excited. It sounds like you guys are doing a great job. And I am really proud of the work that the school's doing. But I also say, we don't know until 10 years or 15 years from now, 20 years from now, when these children who are 4 are adults and being proactive citizens in their community will be when we know for sure. We can look at it. We can see that we're on a path. We can measure ourselves against each other. We can say, like, well, on average, if a child has gotten this much, gotten this literary by this age, then they're set up for success later. There's a lot that it's not to say that none of this data means anything, but 5 years out is not, we don't know a lot. We won't, there's something that we're going to know 10 years from now that we don't know now.
Well, some people are saying that we do know stuff. We do know that special ed kids are getting the short end of the stick, or we do know that some charter schools are not playing fair and they're kicking kids out just before tests go. I wonder if are you comfortable, even though you say this is you got a 10-year tail here, but are you comfortable with giving it a grade?
No, I'm not comfortable with giving a grade. I feel like I'm not that comfortable with like the grading of schools because of these things, because I think it's so much more complicated than that.
But is everybody, people talk about equity and excellence. Address that question of equity. Whether,
right.
Are there, left-handed dyslexics with blue eyes not getting served? Are there any patterns in terms of equity?
Yeah. I think equity is a place where we have a lot of work to do. both because special needs students aren't getting served in the ways that they need to be getting served. And I will just say, because a lot of folks have this argument, they weren't before, right? I mean, this is not a before after. Special education students are not being served well here. They were not being served well before, and we have to keep working on how we're going to serve special needs students. And I don't think that that is because of nefariousness on behalf of schools, right? I don't think that schools on the whole are saying we hate special needs students and we would like to get rid of them all. I think that a few things are happening, including changes in how schools are thinking about special education, right? I think there is some truth to the fact that there are schools that are saying we try not to label as long as we can, and that there may have been an over-reliance on labeling in the past, and so that's changing things, right? And then also I think that there are schools that are overtaxed in their attempt to serve kids with special needs, and they're young schools or new schools or schools that don't have aren't at their full size, right? So they don't have all of the resources that they need in place to really serve all of the special needs students. And so they're either challenged to serve them and do not the best job, or they kind of look the other way towards them being, leaving, right? And if you don't serve people well, at some point they leave either on their own volition or because the situation becomes so bad that, suspension or, something happens, right? And so I think those things are all at play. And then you have parents who are intuitive enough to know that their child's not going to be served well in this school, and so don't put their kids in. So there's a lot happening at once. There's a lot of moving parts to why special education isn't being addressed as it should be. And I think another piece of that is I find it interesting. I've talked to parents about special education who come from a perspective of, I don't want special needs kids, mucking up my child's classroom, right? Like, and making my child not learn. And I think, to me, and this is sort of my anti-competitive streak, this is a conversation we need to have about how it's important that we learn together, right? Like, I am benefited as a person who hears by learning next to a person who's deaf, because it enriches my learning and it makes me a stronger, smarter, uses more parts of my brain, right? To be able to learn sign language or communicate, and meanwhile, they're benefited by learning next to me because they're watching me speak or picking up things that are happening. And so we don't talk about that enough, that special needs students both need additional services, but they also benefit the schools that they're in, right?
Now, Lance Hill argues that privatizing using charters and the notion of educating special needs kids are inherently contradictory. If you privatize, there's a dollar sign, and if it's $8,000 per kid, but you have a special needs kid who costs $28,000, you're running a business. You can't. I mean, I wonder that notion of whether privatizing using charters and providing adequate services for expensive special needs kids, if they're
inherently incompatible.
How would you answer
that? I mean, it's a good argument that they're incompatible because of the costs related. The finances and the background of serving special needs kids is real. But I don't want to give in to the fact that it's incompatible. I think it reveals a need for some level of system, right? Like, there's several things in this. I think some of the things that we're learning about, if you have a lot of independent operators, and this is part of what I was going to say about how charters are changing, like charter movement folks are changing by being involved in New Orleans, right? Because you have in some places, charter schools exist just on the margins, right? There's an overall district and it pretty much takes care of kind of the general. And then there's a few charters on the outskirts that are doing something maybe a little bit different, either because parents are asking for something different, or because communities wanted something different, or because they're specifically trying to close an achievement gap, whatever their, sort of philosophical bent is. In New Orleans, when you have the majority of students in charter schools, it forces charters to not operate as autonomously. Like, they have to. So we have to have a system, right? So if these independently operated schools are going to survive collectively, then there has to be a system in the center. And special education is one of the places that the system has to exist, right? Because it has to be the place that holds down, okay, we've got a lot of autistic kids, and so we need more resources for autistic kids, so we're going to make sure those resources are available to all of these schools, right? And in some ways, that makes us have a landscape that's much more like school-based decision, like I'm blanking on what it was called, but site-based management, right, of schools done with maybe a more formal agreement. Like, I mean, I think that's we're sort of standing with feet on both sides of that. Like, we kind of have site-based managed schools that have there's some regulations that force them to be in system.
It sounds like you're saying that one of the lessons of independence is that you can't be. You have to.
I mean, I think you can't be totally independent. We are reliant, and I think my perspective is that that's just true. Like, when you live in a society, you're not independent. Like, there is no just me, because I'm reliant on how other folks are doing. So if I'm a school, like, if I'm a charter school and I'm doing a great job, but all the other schools are terrible, at some point, like, my great job is meaning it starts to just like lose any sort of, it fades into the water,
So down the road, it sounds like you're saying you see more cooperation among charter schools. I mean, I don't want to.
I do think that down the road, one, I see it happening, right? It's starting to happen for here. I think it's starting to happen in some formalized way. So I think the cooperation between charter schools and types of schools, I'm seeing mechanisms come into fruition that are making that happen. There's more collectivity conversations amongst charter school boards, which is a place where I think there was not a lot of connection before. I think we are seeing some like networking happening between different charter operators. And then you're also seeing these kind of little mini district things happen with like little charter mini districts where, so you have First Line, you have KIPP, you have UNO, you have Algiers, so there's these kind of like CMO operator situations that I think are a nod to the fact that complete independence is really difficult and not sustainable long term. So my question also is, so how will the rest of the schools that aren't part of any of those networks, like, do they network with each other? Do they network with the networks? How is that going to happen? I mean, are we going to have sort of big fish eat little fish until we have essentially a district again? I mean, like, and I think that's a big concern for me, because if part of the reason why we dismantled the school district is because we came to decide that it was impossible to run a school district in a way that was serving all kids, then why would we just sort of replace it, right? And say, well, we're going to have a different kind of school. It'll be a charter school district, but it's still a school. I mean, that doesn't make sense to me. But I do see that there's this need for some type of networking between schools that's happening.
Right now, there's still a lot of direct run schools. I wonder whether the future essentially will be all charter schools. I mean, now 70% of kids, I guess, are in charters. I mean, down the road, can you talk about what you see down the road?
It's so interesting. I just can't picture a New Orleans in which it's all charter, in part because if we actually close or change charter schools that are not being successful, there has to be some place, right? So like with, we just did this with Tubman, right? So Harriet Tubman, Bessie just said, you're not making the cut, and so we're going to move you to somewhere else. If there was no operator ready to take over Tubman, what would we, like, would we just close the school and send the kids elsewhere? I mean, there's always going to be a need for some type of direct run schools that either are sort of schools that were not successful as charter schools and are returning to the fold as a direct run school, or because we needed a school open in a certain area of the city and because of population, or to respond to these like expansions and contractions. So in this landscape, I don't see how we would have no direct run schools. I mean, and also Priestley. I mean, in OPSB, we have a charter school that was a charter school and was operating, and then financially couldn't make it, and so the district brought it back into a direct run school. So I think there's always going to be some of that. And I think that makes sense. My fear is if we don't actually create a landscape that supports direct run schools being good, potentially being able to become excellent, meaning that they have good principals, have the ability to make the kind of site-based school decisions that charter schools can, and have real capacity to really grow into excellence, then we're sort of always creating this like district of last resort, right? So we're always sort of dooming certain kids to being in schools that are the worst schools. And I think structurally that's a problem. We can't create a structure that's designed to always have some like really crappy direct run schools. Like if we're going to have direct run schools, we have to figure out how to make them truly able to bring the kind of education level up, right? And so I feel like we've gotten to that place now with the RSD where the direct run schools, and except in a few cases, I mean, at the elementary level, we actually have some mix. But at the high school level, it's almost like they're the schools of last year. They're kind of the dumping ground schools. And quite frankly, I feel like Paul Vallis tolerated that and sort of continued to allow it to happen and sort of enabled it by not stabilizing staff, by not... I just don't think that we did enough to really work to make sure that high schools were what they needed to be.
So I guess the fear would be charters are for winners, direct run schools are for losers. That sounds
Right.
like that's what you're saying.
Right, exactly. And I think that's kind of where we've gotten to with the high schools in the RSD.
So the challenge for the future is to make direct run schools competitive with charter schools.
And figure out what is it about the charter schools that are successful that is making them successful, which is, I mean, part of the point of having charter schools is to look at things and say, this is what's being really successful. How can we bring that to more schools, charter or direct run?
There are cities which are saying,
That they changed it.
bizarre situation. But Detroit and maybe some other places are looking to New Orleans, saying, well, maybe this is the model. I mean, if somebody in Detroit or some city calls you and says, Aesha, is this
What we should do?
So I guess I wanted to talk about the lessons of New Orleans for the rest of the country.
Yeah. I think New Orleans has I think there's a lot to learn in what we've kind of put together. Some of it around how do you support people with good ideas to bring those good ideas into life, but do so in a way that doesn't take total gambles with children, right? Like that says like, we want to give you an opportunity to try something out, but we also want to make sure that it is. I mean, I think the process of deciding which charter schools are up to par is actually really thorough and good, right? Because you shouldn't be able to open a school just because you can, right? Like, or because you have a board of people. I mean, I think that that's important. I think, and I think that's something that's really important in the question of like, have we privatized and to what degree? And I think we have privatized schools to some degree, but the limitation to nonprofit boards, I think makes a big difference. I actually think that and I think it's telling that all of the for-profit education operators have gone, right? Like they came briefly and they were gone. So, I mean, I think there's a lesson about actually you can't make a profit off education. I mean, it's not a profit-making venture, providing education. It just isn't. And we need to just move away from that notion. And I think that's important. I think a lesson that I don't feel like it's talked about as much as it could be, is the level of civic engagement and the level of advocates and activists and organizations and nonprofits being in this mix, right? I mean, we have a tendency to look at, oh, New Orleans did this, let's look at what the RSD did. But what has happened here has been because a lot of people who are not government employees in any way have done a lot, right? I mean, there's just a ton of energy that's being brought to the table and resources being brought to the table by individual citizens who, whether they are spending hours serving on a charter school board, which, whether you think charters are great or not, there's a whole lot of people who have to spend a lot of time. And so, that's additional inputs that need to happen. And I think, I'm driving around delivering parents' guides to people, right? That's something that it was necessary to this functioning at all and is being done pretty much outside of a government entity, or not pretty much, totally. It's external.
I think I hear you saying that this charter movement has one benefit has been energizing a community. Is that, am I understanding?
I think so. I guess the way I would say it is that New Orleans has benefited from the energizing of a community. In New Orleans, the part of what energized that were people who felt very inspired by the notion of creating these autonomous charter schools, right? So I give a lot of credit to that. I wonder if what would happen if a community got energized around the schools that they have. You know what I mean? I don't think that I think we have to actually take into account that, if all of these same folks who are serving on charter boards and who are involved in all these ways in schools had gotten super involved in the schools in their community, what would have happened? And to be clear, I'm not just pointing the finger at the people who are getting involved now. I watched people try to get involved in schools in Orleans Parish who were pushed out. So it's both the receptiveness of that kind of engaged community civic activism on the behalf of the schools, right? Because the charter schools need that civic activism, so they are very welcoming to it. They're happy to have it. District schools need it too, but they're resistant.
I guess at the end of the day, Aesha, it's maybe one of the questions is, do you need a disaster? Do you need to have a terrible school system and a natural disaster in order to do what New Orleans has done?
I certainly hope you don't need a disaster, because that's terrible. I think that another city could engage and dramatically transform its schools without. So I think another place could engage and dramatically transform its schools without either the kind of catastrophic disaster that was the flooding of Hurricane Katrina, and also without the complete abysmal abandonment of schools, right? I think that, I think more communities need to be having a conversation about what it is that they want of their schools. And by and large, I did not see that tried. In the years that I was here before Katrina covering schools, I did not see the real attempts to have that community conversation, right?
Maybe you do have to be awful before you wake up.
Or you have to be a district that is reflective somewhat of its own, that is willing to say, we're going to bring people, or let's not even rely on it. I think one thing that maybe what needs to happen is communities have to wake up to the notion that it is not going to happen at the hands of someone else, right? If you are a neighborhood around a school and you want to change it, organize yourselves and do it. One of the things that I think Katrina, a gift that I feel really blessed from Katrina, is I feel completely released from the notion of waiting for any entity to do something. I'm just if I think X should happen, then I get the other people who think it should happen too, and we get together and we do it. And by and large, there's, when you pull back the curtain of what we call government, which I've come to think of government as all of us and not some other people sitting somewhere in a room. But when you pull back the curtain on the room that we imagine in our heads, there's a person, maybe. There's not, it's like the Wizard of, it's like Oz, right? And I think Katrina let us pull back this curtain and see that there actually isn't some big mechanism back there. And then people started saying, well, we're just going to do it. And I think that is what is necessary in other communities. I think that's what we had here and has helped drive a lot of this. Yeah, there was policy and regulation and reform ideas and a lot of things that then layered on top of that. But to be clear, some of the reason why people felt empowered to do all that is because they realized there wasn't anybody running the ship. So they were like, I'm just going to do it. I'll write a law and see what happens. I'm going to talk to my legislators. I'm just going to try. And I think before Katrina, I definitely feel like in my conversations with people about the education system, there was a sense of resignation to what it was. Like, yeah, you could try, but nothing ain't going to change, was kind of the general refrain.
Be the change.
Be the change. As that's Gandhi, right? I think as Gandhi says.
Three things on my mind that I hope I can remember all three.
Okay.
I think you're saying you don't have to destroy it in order to save it. Here it got destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying you don't have to destroy it?
Right. I don't think you have to destroy schools to save them. I don't think it requires that. I mean, I think that, I wish I knew, before, what would have happened, in my own neighborhood, right? Like, what would have happened if all the neighbors said, we really want to engage the schools in our neighborhood. Let's start having some meetings and let's just talk to each other about what kind of schools we want, what kind of vision we have, what's happening in these schools, and get engaged. What would have happened? I mean, I think that that's on the table for us now, right? Because now we have schools that are going to need continuously to be called to the table and the carpet and figured out whether or not they're doing what we all need. Do we care about integration socioeconomically and racially, right? We do not have that here in most schools. If that's something that we as a community feel is important, and there's a lot of evidence that shows that you can't get there if you don't create that integration, and there's a lot of people who have been hurt by segregation. So it's clearly important that we address this issue of racial and socioeconomic integration. If we're going to do that, that's going to require neighbors getting together and community members getting together and saying, hi, school, we think you're doing a great job or a not great job or whatever, but this is what we want. This is what we're asking of you.
It doesn't sound like you can one day declare victory.
I don't think so. I think that, for one thing, it's a marathon, right? So education is a marathon. It's constantly evolving, where we have to respond to present day realities and also produce people who are going to be citizens many years from now. So it's just a complicated reality for that to be true. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, there's never a point when we say well, we've done that. Schools are great. Let's move on.
What do you say to people who say, well, charter schools are the magic bullet we've been looking for?
I say, you have not spent a lot of time here or amongst charter schools. Charter schools are a charter school is a kind of governance structure. That's it. That's like saying it's a tool in a toolbox, right? You could have a hammer, but that is not a house. Right? If your goal is to build a house and you have a hammer, that's not it may be a tool that you require to build the house, or one of the tools that you could use. Or you could use a brick or a hammer, but you're going to need some other stuff. And how you use it matters, right? So you can use charters to actually improve outcomes for children or close the achievement gap. You can use charters to create segregated enclaves of privilege. You can use charters to, there's a lot of things that you can use charters to do. And so it's not the answer.
And the last thing, and I did remember all three. I'm very proud of myself. That people talk about, privatizing. Mm-hmm. And I think in some people's minds that means making money. Mm-hmm. Would you just
talk
kind of
about
reflect
privatization?
On, profit versus private?
Right. Yeah, so I struggled early on in this conversation about, is charter school privatization? In my mind, I struggled on the fact of, well, what do you mean by privatization, right? Do we mean, if we mean somebody's making a profit off of it, well, schools and education are actually big business. There's a lot of business in it. The school board was hiring and firing and making massive decisions. If you were a vendor of lettuce and you got the contract with the school board, you were set, right? Because that's going to be a huge contract. So to me, I was kind of I don't know, what are we saying? What is the critique of privatization, right? And so then moving through, this idea that in New Orleans and Louisiana, you have to be a nonprofit entity in order to operate a school in the recovery school district, or to operate a charter school, period. And that caveat, was something that definitely made me feel more comfortable. Oh, well, these aren't going to be businesses coming in to run schools for profit, and they're just going to be like well-meaning nonprofit folks. But I've come to kind of, through this process, I've been able to think a little bit more deeply about that and recognize that nonprofits are private entities, right? They are public. There's a portion of them that's public, meaning that we've agreed that they're doing something good for us. And so we like them, and so we won't make them pay taxes. And, we'll ask them to tell us a few things about themselves, mostly around what money they got. But they get to make a lot of decisions in a sort of private or pseudo-private landscape. Because they're running schools in New Orleans, there's certain things that they do have to do publicly, meet and other things. And I think that's one of the challenges that there are a lot of people on charter school boards who are coming maybe from a nonprofit board place where they actually didn't have to do their work in public, because in other types of nonprofits, you really don't. And so there's these tensions about like, how public do I need to be and how engaged do I have to be with communities? And, I think that we're seeing those rubs and schools wrestling with that a little bit. But at the end of the day, they get to decide who's on their own board, right? That's, I think, a big piece of what makes them private.
I guess it's a profit-making and education,
right?
Contradictory notions.
I think that profit making and public education and education are contradictory notions. Yes. I think one, because I guess probably the biggest reason is because it hasn't happened. Like, folks have not been able to make a profit off of, right? One. Two, I think that we generally are not spending enough money to educate children in K-12 or in higher ed. So, like, if you're making a profit, you're definitely shortchanging somebody. Like, you're definitely not providing something that children need. I think, obviously, there's a lot of services provided to schools that make profit, right? But schools themselves being profit generators in the way that, like, a GE or a General Motors is a bad example, but, some Fortune 500 company, that doesn't seem realistic or plausible to me unless we make some real big changes in how we're spending money on education.
Of course, the thrust behind charters is run schools like a business.
And, I do think there is this run schools like a business thrust. And what I take from that, as somebody who isn't very keen on business, right? Like, I don't think that business is all the answers. But there's some things about how you organize yourself in order to be effective, right? That often businesses have learned the hard way, right? Because the ones that don't organize themselves to be effective tend not to make it. So we can look to the ones that make it and say, like, okay, what did you do? Like, how did you come together in a way that was able to work effectively? Applying that to schools, I think, makes a lot of sense. But the notion that you're making a product, right? That you're starting with nothing and creating something and then selling it to the world, that's not the part of business that I think we need to bring to education, right? And I know that doesn't make sense. I don't think that it works. But the part about, like, are we being the most effective? Are we aligning and I actually think that this is something that any organization or group that is going to be successful, no matter how they structure themselves, nonprofit, business, neighborhood group, circle, whatever, however they structure themselves, if you don't first say, we agree that this is our goal, like, set some goals for yourself, like, we would really like to accomplish X, be really great to each other, and here are our values and philosophy, and then align yourself with that, like, you won't be successful in accomplishing your goals, right? And I think that's one of the things that I do feel like we lacked in a conversation about education in New Orleans before Katrina, and I think that we are getting there now. But we still have a lot of distance to go on having some sort of community consensus about the reason why we want kids to be educated is because they will what, right? Because they will be productive citizens, because they will be critical thinkers, because they will be able to earn for themselves. Like, what is it that we actually want the outcomes to be? I think schools have, because of this process of becoming charters, or because of whatever process helped them kind of crystallize what it is that they're trying to do. And the process of becoming a charter does make you do that. But I think there's other ways that you can do that, have done a better job of setting some of those goals. And I think we're seeing the yield of that, right? Like, people had to come together and say, like, what are our objectives? Okay, so these are our objectives. And then, like, here's where we're trying to get to them. And I think that we maybe were a little lazy about doing that before. Like, that wasn't necessarily happening at every school at the same level, right? Where the schools were sitting down and saying, this is our objective for the year. How are we going to get there? You know, and somebody questioning them on whether or not, is this really how you're going to get there? Is that, is that a good objective? Is that the goal that you should be setting? I think that that was part of what made it harder for educators to be on point, perhaps, in the old landscape. So to me, it seems like, one way that I think would be really interesting is the process of writing a charter involves a lot of educational planning. Like, why don't all schools do that process? Put together a plan for themselves and say, like, this is what we think we need to do.
Charters are an opportunity.
I think so. I think charters, the way that chartering has happened in Louisiana anyway, I should say, because there's some places where the planning is not that rich. But in Louisiana, it's a lot of planning that has to go into becoming a charter school. That process seems to me is probably one that would be really good for any school. So why don't we take that up and say, like, we should do this at every school? Like, every school should go through a process like this and figure out, what are you doing? How are you spending your money? How are you going to make, strong decisions? How, and roll that out.
Paul Vallis. Mm-hmm. You're the teacher. Give Paul Vallis. Rate Paul Vallis.
Wow. I would want to give him a whole report card, but I think overall, I might give him a C. Say his name. I might give Paul Vallis a C. I think I acknowledge that he had a difficult job, right? To move us through getting funds for building and, wrangling that kind of thing, move us through community conversations that were very difficult about how to rebuild schools and where to rebuild them. And so I think there was some things that I can give him credit for being the leader of a team that moved us through those conversations and got us, this $1.8 billion for the reconstruction of schools, which is, going to have tremendous impact in the long run. But I think his engagement of communities, both on the rebuilding question, although that process was probably more full than other processes, but on almost every other thing about the recovery school district was really poor. He had a tendency to overpromise and sort of underdeliver, which just created a churn of frustration that I think was generally not necessary. I think the other place that he did a relatively good job is that I think it is hard to be the leader guy of a system that is disconnected in the way that our system is, right? So, you both can't make edicts to force everybody to do something, and you also can't, although he did often take credit for everything that's happening. So I think that, he had to walk a line, and I know that was difficult, and I think that he often, he did okay at that.
A C, you're a tough grader.
Yeah, well, and then also, the direct-run schools were not what they needed to be. And I don't know if that's because I believe that people in those schools are working really hard. I believe that there are leaders struggling mightily to do what they can for kids. And I think there are some direct-run schools that are doing it, but then there's a lot that aren't. And I don't understand why the direct-run schools couldn't have been better, more effective. I think that I must put some of that at the feet of Paul Vallis for not supporting those leaders in those school communities better. And I'm very frustrated to have him leave saying, like, well, you have to understand we had high mobility in our high schools. We had high mobility in our public schools in New Orleans before Katrina, right? We took them over because they still didn't do the job. So you can't then be the entity that took over the schools because they were not doing well and use the same excuses as to why they aren't doing well. It's not acceptable.
Do the same thing for Paul Pasternak, who's also left. I mean, he's, and use his name as you do that.
Paul Pasternak. I don't know. Paul Pasternak, it's so hard. I think for his, I might give him a C for how he related to New Orleans. But I think I give him a higher grade, you know, I don't know, it's hard. I give him a higher grade for what he was pushing for in the rest of the state. And I think that's something that we're a little myopic about in New Orleans, right? Certainly, all the critiques about Paul Pasternak, I have seen them firsthand and agree. He's very arrogant. He can be very difficult to work with. He's people need to get on the program that I'm on. He's not afraid to like speak his mind, you know, wherever he is and call people out, which means that he was not a consensus builder. But I also acknowledge that there are parts of Louisiana where building consensus might mean compromising on some really big, important issues, especially around what are outcomes for children of color, right? In this state that still has some significant racism, you know, I think, you know, the fact that he was pushing some of those questions, I think is really important, you know. Now, in New Orleans, I think New Orleans was maybe frustrated because he was such a critic of the local school board and therefore, interestingly, seemed to be about removing control or continuing the removal of control of schools from the hands of a black electorate, which I think was sort of where people were feeling here. But interesting, in other parts of the state, like that same critique of a school board might be about balancing control in an electorate that doesn't value very highly black people and black children. So I think this is an interesting place that, you know, I think there's a lot of people in New Orleans who would be like, yeah, we got rid of that Paul Pasternak, except that I think there's some things that that we've talked about, like, you know, that have been discussed, like this alternate diploma business where, you know, not all children are expected to be college ready, right? I mean, we know who that's going to impact, right? We know that the kids that aren't going to be expected to be college ready are going to be, you know, predominantly African American and poor. So, you know, like, are we sort of allowing that kind of thing? I think he was pushing back against some of that stuff, and I certainly agree with that. So now he didn't get it done. I mean, in terms of like figuring out how to balance the politics, but we also are in a place where balancing those politics. I don't know. I mean, I think
he didn't cave.
He didn't cave, but he also didn't succeed. So, like, you know, how do you grade that, right? Like, I want to say, yes, you didn't cave on some of these issues, but I'm also like, but does it matter if you didn't cave if you also didn't actually succeed in getting some of those folks to see the wrongness of their way of thinking?
Yeah. Say a word about why you do it. Why you do this stuff.
You're not from here. You don't have any kids.
Right. Why do I do this? I don't have any children in public schools here. I believe that we all have to get involved in how children are educated, and my particular set of skills seemed most applicable to helping people who are not part of the system understand the system better. And to me, the most important group of people in that reality were parents, and also the people who I consistently did not see at the table as parents. So I really wanted to kind of empower that. And I also just have a lot of parents in my community, right? Like my community of friends and family are a lot of folks with children. And so I found myself consistently having conversations with people who are raising children, who are struggling to understand these things or having various frustrations or have brilliant ideas that they want to share. And I wanted there to be a space for that to happen. And so it just seemed like a natural place. And actually, the Parents Guide, which is the book that we produce, started first. I mean, as a former journalist and as somebody who has skills around editing and proofreading and research and information and design, it made sense for me to be somebody who could produce a guide to schools for families. But that guide needed to be accountable to some body of parents. But there wasn't an existing body of parents to allow the guide to be accountable to. My dream is that every child in New Orleans would have the experience of going to a really great school where their parents are engaged, where they have the opportunity to be educated as a whole child, and where they become critical thinkers, and to live in that community where those children are playing and being part of my life, you know? So